Hello everyone. In today's screencast, we're going to look at making a recommendation in a business report. This is one type of business report that you may have to write for your employer. So let's take a look at the content of what's in a report when we need to recommend a product or a service. We have the introduction, that's where we begin, where we present the issue. In other words, we explain why we need something. For example, a need for new cleaning service or a need for new office furniture. We have to explain what the need of the company is and what the company that we're going to hire needs to be able to do. Our discussion or analysis needs to describe the options. In other words, you went out, you looked for a couple of different companies, and you talk and describe the advantages and the disadvantages of each option. And this is where you're comparing and you're contrasting, for example, 3 cleaning companies. And here we have one person, here we have a team. This looks like a very large company. So we have to talk about what they can offer, what their strong points are, what their weak points are, and how they relate to our need, the need of your company. And finally, in the conclusion, you're going to be making a recommendation. You explain why this company or this company or this company is the best option. And you're looking at price, you're looking at quality, you're looking at everything that relates to the needs of the particular company. So how do we do it? We look at similarities and we look at differences. Because nothing is exactly the same. Although oranges and apples are both fruit, they're different in where they grow, tropical, subtropical, the peel, where they came from. But we also look for what's similar in both of them. They're both fruit, they both grow on trees, and they both give juice. So we're looking at this. If it doesn't have this, then we're not going to look at it. And then this and this are those differences. And which of those differences are better for us? So you can use a Venn diagram to help you see the similarities. You can draw 2 circles, or you can draw 3 circles. And here we've got, this is the same for all of them. This is different, the same for the red and the blue, same for the red and the green and the blue, etc. So what's your focus? We're going to use comparison of adjectives. So when we want to show something's similar, we often use as, the adjective, and as. Jack is just as old as Tom. In other words, they're similar, not exactly the same, but they're similar. So we're showing things that are similar. When we talk about differences, we're looking at contrast. So we can use the ER, taller than. We can use the more handsome than. Again, depends on the form of the adjective. And when we want to talk about something being the most, then we use most, or the biggest, or the tallest. But we can also be a little less exact and choose to say that something isn't equal. French food isn't as spicy as Indian food. So we're comparing French and Indian food and showing that they are different in some way. When we're writing and within the paragraphs and in the paragraph, we want to show similarities and we want to show differences. So connectors or transition words that show us similarities, both, like, likewise, the same as, similarly, just as. These are words that show us that something is similar, almost the same. When we want to show something is different, we use words like whereas, while, unlike, in contrast to, although, however, contrary to, despite, in spite of, in contrast. All of those transition phrases or words that show us differences. So we can see here we've got just like the green fish, the green and the orange, they're all fish, but the green is different in some ways. So what do? Here we have two options for describing. We can first tell about one, for example, here, or we can compare compare the other person. So let's take a look here. First we tell about A, then we tell about B. Students who have Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith are immediately aware of the difference in the lecturing manner of each teacher. The focus here is on Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones is our focal point, and we're looking at the various different features. Pleasant voice, pronounces clearly, lectures are interesting, adds humor, welcomes questions, takes his time, students understand, enthusiastic. These are our features. And we first of all focus on Mr. Jones. He has a pleasant voice, which helps us hold the interest of the students more than Mr. Smith. He pronounces clearly in a rhythmic pattern, emphasizing key words. So we know that all of these are more than Mr. Smith. Now we have to talk about Mr. Smith, because Mr. Smith isn't, he's different. We have to look. So here he has a booming voice compared to a pleasant voice. He commands. He's hard to understand. Not as interesting as. Boring monotone. Hates to be interrupted. Serious and determined mood. So we can see that Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones are very, very different. So we see thus, as above points illustrate, the lectures of Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith are quite different. Another way we can do it is talk about a point and then compare and contrast. Students who have Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones are immediately aware of the difference in the lecturing manner of each teacher. Mr. Jones has a pleasant voice, which helps hold the interest of the students. Mr. Smith, however, has a booming voice, which commands rather than teaches. So we can see these two sentences are focusing on voice. Mr. Jones pronounces clearly in a rhythmic pattern, emphasizing the words whereas. Contrast. Mr. Smith mumbles, running his words together. So again, we're talking about pronunciation. Mr. Jones compared to Mr. Smith. The moderate tone of Mr. Jones makes his lectures more interesting than those of Mr. Smith, who speaks in a boring monotone. So again, it's the tone, it's the level of interest, comparing Mr. Jones and Mr. Smith in the same sentence. Mr. Jones also adds humor to the subject, but Mr. Smith is always serious about each lesson. Mr. Jones welcomes questions from students who don't understand the material, in contrast to Mr. Smith, who hates to be interrupted. Mr. Jones takes his time and explains slowly, while Mr. Smith rushes through each lesson. Mr. Jones is more enthusiastic than Mr. Smith. So what we have is that we're comparing Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones on each point. Each sentence talks about each and how they are similar or different. So when we move on and we have to make a recommendation, what do? And here we have a list of useful phrases. We suggest, propose, recommend. In my opinion, we should. Based on the figures, in other words, the numbers, price, we have. I would therefore recommend that we, having considered the options you may wish to consider. And here again, all things considered, taking these points into consideration. All of these are ways to start that last final paragraph, which gives the recommendation. Because in a report, we always make a recommendation. We've got these options, and here are our recommendations. So now you're ready to write a report. And yes, you've got lots of different kinds of information. Think about it. Put it together. You can show it in a graph. You can show it in a table. And of course, you need to explain it in words. And then you write your report.